of our project stakeholder management knowledge area. So of course, in this particular lesson, we shall be taking a look at the processes we have under project stakeholders management, as well as their input, tools and techniques, and then outputs. So remember earlier on, we said that there are 4 processes under project stakeholders management, which of course would include 1, to identify stakeholders. So this is basically where we come up with our stakeholders list, the stakeholders description, and then also the potential impact that they can have on our project. And then of course, we now plan our stakeholder engagement. So based on the analysis of our stakeholders, we now determine what will be the best approach to manage our stakeholders and then also engage them. So this is where we talk about maybe how do we keep them satisfied, how do we manage the stakeholders closely, how do we keep them informed, and how do we monitor our stakeholders. All of that is what we'll plan out during the planned stakeholder engagement. Then during the managed stakeholder engagement, which is the executing process, this is basically where we execute all of the plans that we have. And then of course, during the monitor stakeholder engagement, we now want to determine the effectiveness of our stakeholder engagement to be sure that it helps us in being able to achieve our project objectives. And that's what we do during the monitor stakeholder engagement. So the very first process here is the identify stakeholders. And we said that the identify stakeholders is the process of identifying project stakeholders regularly and analyzing and documenting relevant information regarding their interest, involvement, interdependencies, influence, and potential impact on project success. So it belongs to the initiating process group. So part of the input to identify our stakeholders would include 1, the project charter. Don't forget that the project charter is a document that formally authorizes the project. And if you remember, when we developed the project charter, there was an aspect of it that talked about project stakeholders. So we need it now when we're identifying stakeholders. So we take some of those stakeholders we have in the charter and then also determine the key players in that project charter. And then of course, those will form part of our stakeholder list. Then also our business documents. These business documents would also enable us to be able to determine stakeholders who are involved in the business. Here you talk about maybe members of the organization, or the customers, or those who are outside the organization that may be affected. So that's possibly what the business documents will give rise to. Then also the project management plan, within which of course we are going to have also other key players within the whole project. Of course, that can include our project team members and then also resources that has been estimated. Then also your project documents. So here you talk about some documents, for example, that you use in carrying out the project. Say, for example, your work breakdown structure and then also your activity list. All of these are project documents that can actually be used to do your stakeholder identification, agreements that you have with your vendors or suppliers, especially during your procurement management. So don't forget that your vendors are also part of your stakeholders, and that's part of the reason why agreement is also an input in the identify stakeholders process. And then of course, you now have enterprise environmental factors. So these are stakeholders who are outside your circle of influence that you also need to identify within the stakeholders register. So this can include the community, government, host community, and then also every other entity that's outside of this, your project initiative. Then also you now have your organizational process assets. I mean, anything of value that can aid you in performing this process. For example, previous stakeholder register, and then also lessons learned from previous projects. All of these are part of the inputs that can assist us during the stakeholder identification process. Of course, part of the tools and techniques would include expert judgment. So when we talk about expert judgment here, we're basically referring to getting the opinion of a subject matter expert to help us to effectively identify our stakeholders. Then you need to gather data and then also analyze the data and be able to represent those data. These are part of the things that can also help you to effectively identify your stakeholders. And then also don't forget meetings. When we talk about meetings here, we're not talking about the meetings of the project team where we stay together and brainstorm and be able to come up with the stakeholders who may be involved in our project. So the output will be our stakeholder register, which is basically the documentation of all our stakeholders. And then you can do a change request if the need arises. And then of course, if the change request is approved, you now update any document that the change may affect. So I want you to take a look at your student workbook and complete the table below. Use 2 stakeholders identified earlier in the project to complete the stakeholder register. So the next process is now the planned stakeholder engagement. So during the planned stakeholder engagement, this is where we develop approaches to involve project stakeholders based on their needs, expectations, interests, as well as potential impact on the project. So basically what we talk about here is the fact that the planned stakeholder engagement is where we determine how we're going to now manage our stakeholders. That's what happens here. So the input would include the project charter, which of course already captures some of the list of our stakeholders, and then also the project management plan, of course, because after we have done this, we need to integrate it into the project management plan. Then also other project documents that will give us an idea of how to effectively manage our stakeholders. Then of course agreements also, because agreements would also enable us to be able to determine contractual obligations. This also gives us an idea of how to relate with our stakeholders, especially our vendors. Then enterprise environmental factors, which are factors that are not within our control, as well as the organizational process assets. So part of the tools and techniques we can use when we plan stakeholder engagement would include one, expert judgment. So expert judgment here refers to opinion of subject matter experts. Then we also talk about data analysis, data representation, as well as data gathering. Of course, notice that these three is basically a data gathering process that will enable us to determine the most and the best effective way to manage our stakeholders. Then also decision making. So decision making here talks about our ability to determine or take relevant decisions with regards to how best to manage our stakeholders. And then also don't forget that meetings is an integral technique here, because this is where we now come together and then brainstorm on the most effective way to manage our stakeholders. Then the output will be our stakeholder engagement plan, which is basically a plan as to how we're going to be able to engage our stakeholders. So if you remember earlier on, we talked about what we refer to as a power interest grid, where we classified our stakeholders based on their level of power as well as their level of interest in our project. And we said that for stakeholders who fall under quadrant A, that is high power, low interest, we need to keep them satisfied. So at the planning stage is where we now determine what is the best and most effective way to keep stakeholders who we say we're going to keep satisfied. How best can we keep them satisfied? Then for the quadrant B that represents stakeholders that have high power and low interest, we said we need to manage them closely. So this is where we determine efforts necessary to manage them closely. What does it mean and how effectively can we do that? Then for quadrant C, which represents stakeholders that have high interest and low power, remember we said here we now need to keep them informed. So here we now determine the information that needs to be sent, and then what will be the frequency. And then for quadrant D, which represents stakeholders that have both low power and low interest, remember we said here that we need to monitor such stakeholders. So this is where we determine effectively how best to be able to engage such stakeholders, and that's what happens during this very stage. So the next is now manage stakeholder engagement. So this is an executing process. So if you remember in the last slide, we planned how we're going to engage our stakeholders. So this is now where we begin to engage our stakeholders, and that's what happens during the manage stakeholder engagement. So that's why we said that this is the process of communicating and working with stakeholders to meet their needs or expectations, address issues as they occur, and foster appropriate stakeholder engagement in project activities throughout the project life cycle. So it belongs to the executing process group. So part of the input to manage our stakeholders would include one, our project management plan, which of course would already stipulate how best we're going to manage our stakeholders. Then also other project documents, your enterprise environmental factors, which are factors that you may not have within your control when it comes to stakeholder management, as well as organizational process assets, lessons learned from previous engagements that we may have had with our stakeholders. So part of the tools and techniques, as usual, you have your expert judgment. So during the managed stakeholder engagement, we might need the opinion of subject matter experts. Then here you need communication skills, because you need to effectively communicate with your stakeholders, and that's one very important way to manage them. You also require interpersonal and team building skills. This is necessary because for you to effectively manage and relate with your stakeholders, interpersonal skill becomes absolutely necessary. Then also you need to set ground rules, especially for your team and internal stakeholders. This will help you define expectations and stick to them. And then of course meetings is also part of the tools and techniques you can use to manage your stakeholder engagement, because meetings effectively help you to brainstorm and determine the most effective way to manage your stakeholders. So the output will be your change request. And we'll talk about change request now. Change request simply means that if we determine that the management approach we have adopted can actually impact our project baselines, for example, the cost, the schedule, and then the scope, or even the quality, we may now need to do a change request in order to update all of these requirements. And then, of course, if the change request goes through the perform integrated change control process and it gets approved, you now need to update the project management plan and any other document that the change may possibly affect. So the final process is the monitor stakeholder engagement. So during the monitor stakeholder engagement, this is basically where we'll determine the effectiveness of our stakeholders management, and then also we're able to determine how effective are we engaging with our stakeholders, and then also is our strategy, our plan giving us the desired result. So that's why we say that the monitor stakeholder is the process of monitoring project stakeholder relationships and tailoring strategies for engaging stakeholders through modification of engagement strategies and plans. So it belongs to the monitoring and controlling process group. So part of the input would include our project management plan. Of course, don't forget that this has already stipulated how we're going to manage our stakeholders. Of course, the stakeholder management plan will already be an integral part of this project management plan. Then also other project documents, your work performance data, as well as your organizational process assets and enterprise environmental factors. So the work performance data refers to raw facts, which of course can help us to determine how effectively we are managing our stakeholders. So at the end of the day, part of the tools and techniques would include our data analysis as well as data representation. This is basically where we analyze data with regards to the result we're getting in the course of the project implementation based on the stakeholder engagement that we have put in place. And then of course this will now enable us to take relevant decisions. And then also part of the tools and techniques you require to monitor your stakeholder will include your communication skills, because you need to effectively communicate, and then also interpersonal skills as well as meetings, where you now determine if your stakeholder engagement is actually working or you need to carry out specific changes with regards to that. So the output will be your work performance information, which basically talks about the outcome of the analysis you may have made, and then you can do a change request if the need arises, and then of course update any document that this particular change may possibly affect. So in this particular lesson, we took a look at project stakeholders management. And under project stakeholders management, we said that there are 4 processes. And the 4 processes we have are, we identify stakeholders, and then of course, we plan our stakeholders management, and then we manage stakeholders engagement, and then finally, we monitor stakeholder engagement. So this is the very last lesson in this particular series on our PMP certification. I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. Once again, I want to thank you for